The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Jephthah. So I posted a video about the story of Abraham and Isaac, and it's an incredibly popular, famous story most people are familiar with. I think perhaps it's the case that fewer people are familiar with the story of Jephthah. But when I posted the video, somebody said, well, commented on YouTube essentially, why on earth would you spend time on the Abraham and Isaac story with regard to whether or not God is the type of God that might accept child sacrifice, and instead go straight to the Jephthah story? And there are reasons for that. One is that the Abraham and Isaac story, as I pointed out in the video, is supposedly a test. And so if it is a test, and it's a test for Abraham to see if he will obey God, which God already knows. But anyway, the comments about that test are in the Isaac video, because if it turns out God isn't the kind of God that would demand a child sacrifice, then Abraham's answer is essentially wrong. To obey would be wrong, and instead you should say, I don't know who you are, but my God would never demand a child sacrifice, so depart from me, foul spirit. There's a reason, though, that I don't go to the Jephthah story, and it's because it's actually going to take a little bit more time, and it's not as clear-cut. But bear with me, grab your Bibles, open it up to Judges chapter 10, and we'll go through a little bit about Jephthah. And it's a different story with different thoughts. In some ways, it's almost the opposite of the Abraham and Isaac story. Okay, so I'm not going to bother reading every single verse in this story. It's a full chapter and some change about Jephthah, and we're going to have quite a few things to go through with it. The gist of the story is that Jephthah makes a deal with God, saying, if you deliver the enemy unto me, whatever comes out of my home when I arrive first, I will sacrifice to you. And then he gets home, and it's his daughter who comes out of his home first. And then he's oh so sad, and gives her a couple of months to go off and bemoan how she's not going to be able to lose her virginity, and then he sacrifices her. There are already people bristling, because there are a number of apologetics about this particular passage that include the notion that perhaps Jephthah did not actually offer his daughter as a human sacrifice or a burnt offering. And so it's one of the reasons why I didn't begin by using this example. But we're going to go through the story here, because there's some other interesting components to the Jephthah story that I think are worth knowing. So we're in Judges chapter 10, and Judges is essentially a list of the judges who ruled over Israel at different times. And it lists who they were, kind of what they did, and how long they ruled. For example, when you begin chapter 10, the first judge listed there is Tola. He gets a grand total of 2 verses. He comes after Abimelech, which I'm going to do a separate video on Abimelech at some point, because that is an interesting story that's problematic as well. But it starts with, after Abimelech was a man of Issachar named Tola, son of Puah, the son of Dodo. He rose to save Israel. He lived in Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim. He led Israel 23 years, then he died and was buried in Shamir. So Tola gets 2 verses. He led Israel for 23 years, 2 verses. Next is Jer. Jer gets 3 verses. He followed Tola, led Israel 22 years, 3 verses. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys, and they controlled 30 towns in Gilead, which to this day are called Havoth-Jer. When Jer died, he was buried in Kamon. 22 years, 30 sons, 3 verses. Beginning at verse 6, we start the story of Jephthah, and I'm going to paraphrase a lot of this, just because it's a lot to read, and I don't want to get flagged for reading from the copyrighted NIV, and I don't have my King James handy. So the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths and the gods of Aram, gods of Sidon, Moab, etc., and the Ammonites and the gods of the Philistines. And because the Israelites forsook God and no longer served them, he became angry with them. And so he sells them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites. Now, you've got to remember, this is a Jewish history that's being reported here. And so it's not necessarily clear that the view was God is mad at us and has turned us over to the Philistines, so much as there was a literal God handing them over. It may be viewed as if just they had been disobedient to God, and because of that, they were just generally suffering. The mix between metaphor and literal gets kind of confusing. But the Philistines and the Ammonites had crushed them, and for 18 years they'd oppressed the Israelites. The Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah. Then the Israelites cried out to the Lord, "We have sinned against you, forsaking our God and serving the Baals." We're not going into the Stargate ball, but it's interesting. Essentially, they stopped serving God, and then they started getting their ass kicked. And then they started being essentially owned and governed by other people. And so they cry out to God, "Hey, we've sinned against you, and we really need some help." And evidently God replies and says, "Hey, you know, when it was the Egyptians or the Ammonites, the Philistines, etc., 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 and you cried out to me for help, didn't I save you then? But you've forsaken me for some other gods, so I'm not going to save you. Go get those other gods to get you out of trouble." Now, this not only seems a little petty, but it digs in kind of on the henotheistic aspect of the Jews. Oh, Judaism is the great monotheism. No, when you look at the Torah, the prophets, etc., what you get is a henotheistic view, or the notion that there are many gods, but their God is the best one. Their God is their God. Their God will protect them. And this is why the story of the Israelites is, you know, oh, God creates us, and then, we're done with that God. We're going to go get a different God. Well, please take us back, God. Please take us back. And now we're done with that God. We're going to go get a different God. This is the tragic comedy that makes up the entire Christian Old Testament. And in this case, they're saying, hey, we know we sinned against you, God, and we know we went and we worshipped other gods, but please take us back. And God's like, nah, I'm done taking you back. Go ask those other gods for help. And then the Israelites say to the Lord, but we've sinned. Do whatever you want to do to us, but please rescue us. And then they got rid of the foreign gods, and they decided to serve the Lord. And he could bear Israel's misery no longer, is what it says. So essentially, it's like, I don't want anything to do with you. No, we'll get rid of these other gods. It's very much like a jealous, significant other type thing here. And of course, the Bible portrays God as a jealous God, etc. And so you get to the end here of chapter 10. When the Ammonites were called to arms and camped in Gilead, the Israelites assembled and camped at Mizpah. The leaders of the people of Gilead said to each other, whoever will take the lead in attacking the Ammonites will be head over all who live in Gilead. Now, they've essentially got God on their side again, is sort of the take from this. Oh, we'll get rid of those other gods, we'll put God on our side. Now, Jephthah was a man of Gilead. His father was listed as, his father was Gilead. And so there's some confusion as to whether that means he was the actual Gilead that the town was named after, or because Jephthah's mother was a prostitute, if he was just a bastard. And so they just say his father was Gilead, as in the men of Gilead or whatever. But I don't think that flies. I think it has to be Gilead, the individual, because the very next verse talks about Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they were grown, they drove Jephthah away. And they said, you're not going to get any inheritance from our family because you're the son of another woman. So Gilead has a wife and sons. Gilead knocks up a prostitute, and she has Jephthah. And Jephthah is driven out by Gilead's other sons, saying, you're not getting any of our inheritance because, you know, you're the son of another woman. So Jephthah fled from his brothers in southern land of Tob, where a gang of scoundrels gathered around him and followed him. Basically, he became the strong man for a group of thieves. And when the Ammonites were fighting against Israel, the elders of Gilead went to Jephthah in the land of Tob, and they said, come, be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites. Now, here's the group of people, here's the group of Israelites who have made a deal to stop worshiping other gods so that God will protect them. At no point does it say that God told them to go to Jephthah. For some reason, this town decides, hey, you remember that prostitute's son who was kind of a badass and got run off by his brothers? Let's go get him to come be the leader of all of us. I don't understand exactly how that all works out, but they wanted him to come be the leader. And Jephthah's like, hey, don't you hate me? And didn't you drive me away from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble? There is an incredible mirrored symmetry here. The Israelites go to God, and God's like, hey, Didn't you forsake me? Go ask the gods that you're worshiping now. And then they go to Jephthah, and Jephthah's like, hey, don't you hate me? Didn't you drive me out of my father's house? Why do you come to me now that you're in trouble? And the elders are pleading with him, saying, nevertheless, we're turning to you now. Come with us and fight the Ammonites, and you'll be the head over all of us. You will be our new leader. Please save us. Please save us. Now, I don't know, maybe because he's running a gang of thieves, maybe because he's a big badass or a great warrior or whatever else. And Jephthah says, suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites, and God gives them to me. Will I really be the leader? And the elders are like, yep, we promise. The Lord is our witness. We'll do it. So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them, and he repeated all of his words before the Lord of Mizpah. Then Jephthah sent messages to the Ammonite king with the question, what do you have against me that you attack my country? So now the Israelites have appealed to God, and God's like, go back to those other gods. And then no, we'll get rid of them. We promise we'll be true to you. Now they got a God. Then they go to Jephthah. And Jephthah's like, well, I'm only going to do it if you make me, the full-on leader of everything. Okay, sure, we'll do that too, because we really, really, really don't want to lose. The next handful of passages from verse 14 through 28 is about Jephthah sending a messenger to the Ammonite king, and he's like, hey, I'm basically asking you, or starting at verse 13, he's like, what beef have you, or 12 is what beef have you got with my country? 13, the Ammonites reply, hey, when Israel came out of Egypt, they took away my land from Arnon to the Jabbok, all the way to the Jordan. Now give it back peacefully. So the king of the Ammonites is essentially saying, when you guys came up out of slavery, you conquered all these lands and you took the lands that belong to me. I would like for you to give it back to me peacefully, or I'm going to take it, is what's essentially going on. And then Jephthah recounts an interesting tale of what the Israelites did and didn't do when they came out of Egypt. The thing you got to remember is that most of the purpose of what we now view as the Christian Old Testament, especially in this section right here, is to tell the Jewish history. We have no idea how accurate any of this is. It's unlikely that it's particularly accurate. We're relying on hearsay accounts. This is what my father was told by his father, and you're talking about individual tribes running different towns in different areas who are evidently picking up, the type of thing that you would want to sell it as true is, hey, we didn't just go with one of the 30 sons from our previous judge. We went and we found the son of a prostitute to represent the city because he was the best warrior, and this is, they can play it up, this is what God wanted us to do. And that makes the story seem like it might be more true. In much the same way that when you get to the resurrection account, it's the prostitutes, it's the women who are the first witnesses, and they're completely unreliable. These sorts of themes retrace their steps throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament. So Jephthah sends a letter back saying, hey, Israel didn't take the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites. When they came out of Egypt, they went through the wilderness, the Red Sea, and they went to the king of Edom saying, hey, give us permission to go through your country, but Edom wouldn't listen. So they went to Moab, and he refused. And so Israel stayed at Kadesh. And then they traveled through the wilderness, skirted the lands of Edom and Moab. They're basically ducking and dodging everybody who doesn't want these refugees, these supposed escapees of slavery, to pass through their territory. So like weaving this trail around. Oh, let us pass through your country to our own place, but Sihon didn't trust Israel to pass through his territory, so he mustered all his troops and encamped at Jahaz and fought with Israel. And then the Lord God, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and his whole army in Israel's hand. So the story Jephthah's telling here is, look, we didn't take your lands. What happened was we tried to go this way and they said no. We tried to go this way and they said no. We tried to go this way and they said no, so we fucking killed them. That's essentially what the story is when they get to Sihon. The Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and his whole army in Israel's hands, and they defeated them. Israel took over the land of the Ammonites, or Amorites, who lived in that country, capturing all of it from Arnon to the Jabbok and the desert to the Jordan. Now, isn't that what the Ammonite leader accused him of? Hey, you took all my lands from the Arnon to the Jabbok and from the desert to the Jordan. And then Jephthah writes back and says, no, we didn't. We tried to go this way, they wouldn't let us. Tried to go this way, they wouldn't let us. Tried to go this way, they wouldn't let us, so we killed them, and then we took the lands that you say we took. But This is where it gets interesting, because Jephthah, as he's explaining this in verse 23, says, "Since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out before his people, Israel, what right have you to take it over? Will you not take what your god Chemosh gives you? Likewise, whatever the Lord our God has given us, we will possess. Are you any better than Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he even quarrel with Israel, a fight, and blah, blah, blah." So what he's saying is, okay, we only took that land because God saw fit to grant it to us. You have no right to take it back. And by the way, haven't you taken other people's lands too? And they all did this. Whatever God has granted us the right to be ours is ours, and you don't have any right to take it back. So let God, the ultimate judge, decide this dispute this day between the Israelites and the Ammonites. So he's not really making an appeal to say, hey, let's go talk to God and see which one of us he wants to have this land that you claim was yours that we took, because they already have their answer. God gave it to them by allowing them to conquer the people who were there and take it. The king of Ammon, however, paid no attention to this message that Jephthah sent him. And then the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah. This is verse 29, and there's a reason why this is important. The story that we're about to get to of Jephthah making a deal with God to win this new battle against the Ammonites is distinct from the Abraham and Isaac story, because there God comes to Abraham and says, I want you to take your son Isaac up here and make a blood sacrifice of him to me. This takes place later when the Mosaic laws already have a prohibition against burnt sacrifices, human blood sacrifices, which one would argue should have always been a prohibition, and Abraham should never have been able to be fooled by such a thing. But at least in the Abraham and Isaac story, God comes to him and says, I want you to kill your son. In this story, the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah, and he crossed Gilead and Manasseh and passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And in verse 30 it says, and Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. It doesn't say God demanded anything. Jephthah basically said, God, I'm ready to make a bargain. And what he says is, if you deliver the Ammonites into my hands, then whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return home in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Now, this passage from verses 29 and 30 29 through 31 is incredibly important, because it seems that God is directing Jephthah to attack the Ammonites, and then Jephthah, of his own volition, makes a deal with God that says, if you let me win this, whatever comes out of the door of my house when I return triumphant, I will offer as a burnt offering. And that language isn't really subject to being massaged. So Jephthah went over and fought the Ammonites, and God delivered them into his hands. So this whole deal that Jephthah had done of, let's let God decide, which was an attempt to say God's already decided, it's basically, we took your lands once before and God gave them to us, but if you want to fight, God is still on our side, and we're going to fight you and destroy you, and we're going to keep hold of those lands. So he's successful. And when Jephthah returned, this is verse 34, to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of the timbrels? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. So Jephthah makes a deal with God that whatever comes out of his house when he returns home, whatever first comes out of his house when he returns home, he'll sacrifice. He has one child, no other sons or daughters. His wife, I don't think, is mentioned in this story at all. So, maybe he was expecting his wife to come out and he was willing to offer his wife as a burnt offering. Who knows? Maybe they had a goat in the house as a pet goat or a dog, and maybe he was going to offer that as a burnt offering. But at least it should have been foreseeable that his only child might be the thing to come out of his house. And certainly, if there is a God that knows the future and knows the outcome of all these things, then God knew when Jephthah made that vow that the daughter was going to be the one to come out. So when Jephthah sees her in verse 35, he rips his clothes and he cries, oh no, my daughter, because you've made me sad and I'm devastated because I made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break. he seems angry at his daughter for being the first one to greet him. So here's the brave warrior coming home, and his daughter rushes out to meet him, and this causes so much sadness that he rips his clothing. And she, without missing a beat evidently, says, "My father, you've given your word to the Lord. So do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request. Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." Or to mourn her virginity is how it is in the King James and others. And he says, you can go. And he let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he vowed. And she was a virgin. From this comes the Israelite tradition that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah of Gilead. Now, that last line, I don't want to just throw it away, because it seems that it might be the reason for all of this, that there's some sort of tradition where the young women go out for 4 days to mourn this. The interesting thing here are the different apologetics that arise when trying to explain this, because a barefaced reading of the text, Jephthah promises to offer whatever comes out of his house first as a burnt offering to God. His daughter comes out. He tells her the deal. She's okay with the deal. Just give me a couple months to bemoan the fact that I'm never going to marry and have kids. And then he burns her as he said he would, because he did unto her as he vowed. There's not much wiggle room there. And despite that, apologists have basically twisted themselves in pretzels to try to offer some sort of softening of this text. In some of the Jewish traditions, this entire passage is taken at face value, and it's used as an object lesson. And it is sort of, be careful about the vows you make to God, because they are unbreakable, and don't offer up anything unless you are actually willing to sacrifice it. You know, it's a sort of kind of Aesop's fable type thing. And it's not even clear whether any of this actually happened, but it is all portrayed as historic. So one of the Jewish apologetics is, yeah, all this happened, and the lesson to be learned is, if you're going to make a deal with God, you better make sure that you know what you're getting into, because these things can't be countered. They're not reversible or revocable. But that wasn't good enough, because it puts God in the position of appearing to be okay with a child sacrifice. At no point in the narrative does it say God agreed to Jephthah's vow and granted him. But it does say Jephthah made a vow and then God delivered. And it would seem that if you were a God that was trying to be opposed to human sacrifice, then if somebody vowed to sacrifice a human to you and you knew it was going to be a human, then you wouldn't honor your part of the deal. On the other hand, I suppose if Jephthah's just a really good warrior, God would have had to intervene on behalf of the Ammonites, which then would have screwed over Israel. It's strange, the type of tap dancing you get into to try to make sense of this. For other Jewish apologists and for most Christian apologists, they just claim that she wasn't actually sacrificed as a burnt offering, but instead was given over to the church, given over to the service of God, given over to the synagogue, the temple, to serve there as, essentially a maiden, a slave girl, etc. I don't know how that makes that a whole lot better. Because the thing that always strikes me with Jephthah, that is different from the Abraham and the Isaac story, is that God goes to Abraham and says, sacrifice your son. And Abraham's like, sure, man, I'll do it. You're God. I'll do whatever you tell me, because I'm an idiot. In this case, Jephthah is the one who's like, I'll sacrifice whatever comes out of my house, as a hasty thing, supposedly, to win something. God seems to honor the deal. And then there's a sacrifice. And there's no consideration and no mention of Jephthah's wife and what she thought about this deal, because women just generally don't matter, which is also true of Jephthah's daughter, because her wishes and her desires are never taken into account, other than we're going to give you a couple months to go. Who knows what she was actually doing? I doubt she just ran off and cried about the fact that she was going to die. Maybe it was spring break. Maybe she went off and had a party. But they had to include that line, and she was a virgin, to show that she didn't go off and do anything untoward. She was being holy and honorific of her, or honoring her father's wishes, because she's just a thing. Jephthah's daughter, his, as far as I can tell, unnamed daughter, is just a thing. She's just a thing in Jephthah's mind because he's going to sacrifice whatever thing comes out of his house when he returns. She's just a thing in God's mind because the sacrifice doesn't matter. He knows what's going to happen. She is just a thing in the eyes of the author of this story because her desires are never considered. And even in her own part of the narrative, she is presented as somebody who is completely selfless, doesn't have any wants or desires of her own. Her daddy basically just offered her up to a god in order to win a battle, and that's just the way life is, and that's the way things work. And this is in direct opposition to the notion that God is somehow, the God of the Israelites, is somehow opposed to human sacrifice or burnt offerings. There are some apologetics that say that this whole story is sort of designed to reinforce the notion of the Mosaic Law against burnt human sacrifices. And that essentially the people of Israel just kept rebelling. So God would give them over to somebody else, and God would give them over to somebody else. They just kept rebelling. And this story is supposed to be the kind of glue that gets them, at least for a while, to stop rebelling. And so, of course, there is a story about a potential burnt human offering to God, because that's a very sort of thing that the Israelites had abandoned, this prohibition, when they went off to serve Baal and other gods. They were going back in the direction of human sacrifice, and this story was essentially fabricated, if it was metaphorical, if it was not literal, to teach them that lesson. But even if it were literal, it was God teaching them that lesson. God decides to teach them that he's opposed to human sacrifice by arranging a story where there's pretty clearly, based on the straightforward reading of the text, a human sacrifice. The Abraham and Isaac story basically is about a test that I argue failed. You can go back and watch that video. The Jephthah story there's almost not even a proper human component. The individual here for which there appears to be the most sympathy is Jephthah. He's the son of a prostitute who is thrown out by his brothers. And then the people of Gilead come back to him when he's running around with brigands and thieves and say, come lead us. And he comes to lead them, and he tries to work out a diplomatic compromise, which is a really terrible attempt at this, because somebody's basically like, you took our lands. And Jephthah says, no, we didn't take your lands. We tried this, we tried this, we tried this. They wouldn't let us pass, so that we took your lands. But God gave them to us. And then he rends his clothes, and he's incredibly sad that he's going to lose his daughter. But what else could he have expected? If he had a wife and his wife came out first, wouldn't he have rented his garments over that and been mourned the fact that he was losing his wife? But she's a woman, and women don't matter. She's not even mentioned. There's a lot more to the stories here in Judges. And as I was looking back through this, my initial thoughts about the story of Jephthah all center around those final verses where he makes the deal, he comes back home, his daughter greets him, and then he gives her 2 months, and then he sacrifices her as he said he would do. And it doesn't matter how you view that did unto her as he said he would, whether you view it as an actual burnt human offering or whether she just became a permanent maid or slave girl to the temple. Both of those things fail to take her autonomy and her value as a human being into account at all. The only thing that matters is the deal that Jephthah made with God. But as I went back and read through it, I found this stuff in chapter 10 that tells the full story of Jephthah. And it's strange because you remember those other judges that got 2 or 3 sentences and they served for 23 or 22 years. Jephthah served for 6 years. That's it. And yet he's got far more told about him than some of the other judges that served for a long time. Why? Because Jephthah was the judge who was in charge in the battle against the Ammonites to maintain control of this particular plot of land. And he's the one who made a vow to God that ultimately really cost him. And that's the message they want to take away. And the message I take away is, if the story's real, it's the daughter who made the sacrifice. It's the daughter who was the one who was willing to go along with whatever deal God made, or her father made with God. She's the one that's disregarded. She's unnamed. You don't tend to name women in the Bible unless they have something significant with a man who's in charge, etc. I went through that on women's values in the Bible, or the value of women in the Bible. So the reason I didn't go to the Jephthah story when I was talking about the Abraham and Isaac one, and it's because there are different lessons to be learned from them, and because it's worth going through many of these stories to show the various problems that exist in the Bible. And that brings me to the end of this video, but with a note that in the very near future, perhaps December or January, I can't promise because I don't exactly know what's going to come up, but we're going to go back a chapter or so in the book of Judges. Because in Judges 9, you have the story of Abimelech, depending on how it's supposed to be pronounced. And there's some really interesting stuff in there. This parade of judges that ruled and governed and saved Israel through this time, as it's chronicled in these books, is as much an interesting mirror parade of God's failures through the entirety of the Old Testament as anything I've read. It's really strange. And it's one of the reasons why if you walk into a church, you're more likely to hear a sermon from the New Testament than from the Old. And if you're going to hear a story from the Old Testament, it's probably going to relate to Genesis, Exodus. It is probably not going to come from Judges. It is probably not going to be a list of begats. It's probably not going to be anything that may have had significance more for the Jews than for the prophecies and things that led up to Jesus in the New Testament. But that's it for this one. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.